Hello, everybody.
Turn this up in my headphones, Charles.
Classic, man. Never change.
Just do it now.
Never change. Yes, yes, yes. Hello, everybody. Welcome to another super exciting, super special episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy podcast. My name is Charles, and with me, as always, is my friend Dylan.
Hey, Charles, can you run that back one more time? The song.
Are you
that's
serious?
My jam, right?
Are you serious? You want me to run it again?
Do you know I really think that this podcast should just be a loop of the intro music, and then at the end we should just play the outro music.
Yeah, I mean, the intro music is a banger. The outro music is solid also, man. I wouldn't blame it. When we found that music, we just heard it and we're like, these are the tracks, you know. I think we found the outro first. We were looking for an intro, right? And we were like, we like the song, but it's not the intro. And then it was like, yo, that's totally the outro. And that's our exciting story.
Yeah.
But it was one of those things where we heard a bunch of tracks and we very quickly decided that these were the ones we wanted to use.
We thought it was going to be a longer journey. And
that's right.
Instead, landed on it pretty quickly. But we've got a relatively long journey, I guess, to discuss today, Charles. Maybe.
Journey is the name of the game here. We've got our continuation of our Lord of the Rings discussion. We are now on Book 2, The Two Towers. So, very huge moment for any fantasy podcast would be their Lord of the Rings series discussion.
Yeah, we're joining the ranks of every other fantasy podcast out there by discussing the Lord of the Rings.
I mean, how can you not? You
gotta do it.
The grandfather of all of these things. I mean, one of the most influential works for me, for sure. But this is your first time reading The Two Towers, as we all know.
Yep.
And do you want to start off with your first impressions, or should I drop this quote that I have prepared for us?
Drop the quote.
All right, so I wanted to kind of start off our conversation with, in the intro of my version of The Two Towers I was reading, it had a really nice short review by C.S. Lewis, who was actually a fan of J.R.R. Tolkien. People might not know, C.S. Lewis was the author of the Chronicles of Narnia, the first book being The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. So I'm just going to go ahead and get right into his review. No imaginary world has been projected which is at once multifarious and so true to its own inner laws. None so seemingly objective, so disinfected from the taint of an author's merely individual psychology. None so relevant to the actual human situation, yet free from allegory. And what fine shading there is in the variations of style to meet the almost endless diversity of scenes and characters, comic, homely, epic, monstrous, or diabolic. That's the review.
That's interesting.
It's a really well eloquated review. Better than what we usually see.
Eloquated a word?
Is it? You're the scholarly type. You tell me.
I would check Google if it was worth our time. Do you know what? Tweet at us. Let us know if eloquated is a word. I would say it is eloquent, and
it's not a word.
Oh, you Googled it?
Yes. It comes up with, did you mean eloquent? Or Ali quoted, A-L-I.
Did you mean Ali quoted?
I did not.
Oh. Well, either way, we get your point, Charles, which is that it is
kind of funny, though. It's like, it's well eloquated. This is why I'm not a writer, everybody, and C.S. Lewis is. Or was?
I was drawn to this line, so disinfected from the taint of an author's merely individual psychology, because I find myself wanting to push back against that as a taint. Like it's tainted. I guess when I think of my favorite author would be Joe Abercrombie, and I would say that his individual psychology is what makes those books so unique and
Yeah.
awesome in a way that no other series has been able to capture. So
That's
I don't know if it's a
fair.
taint.
I would say that like this is kind of old school. I don't think these guys would have been ready to read something by Abercrombie fully,
Probably not.
but I do. There's a lot I like about that line. I think what he was getting at was like it wasn't so obviously an author trying to project his own beliefs onto people. Like Tolkien went out of his way to create characters that have different opinions and psychologies. Essentially, very empathetic. Which, if you're building a whole world, you kind of need that empathy to be like, okay, this character, like, okay, Faramir needs to be able to see things more objectively than, say, Boromir did, or, Sam is very single minded and Frodo's compassionate. So it's like all these different um, psychologies going on and that exist beyond just his own biases, which not an easy thing to do as a human being.
For sure. And I see a lot of the value in what Tolkien is able to provide in The Lord of the Rings with just his ability to convey such a fully realized world. And maybe that's part of what C.S. Lewis is getting at here, where we talked in our last episode about how a lot of authors nowadays think, hey, I'll show them the tip of the iceberg when it comes to my world building and let them assume that there
Yeah.
is a whole lot of iceberg underneath, even if I didn't put in all this work beforehand to actually flesh out what's underneath the tip of the iceberg, which makes sense from
Right.
a pragmatic standpoint. But the idea of being in the Lord of the Rings world while you're reading these books, there's something you just can't replace by only showing the tip of the iceberg that Tolkien has here. And it's amazing to think that it came from just one person. Like one person's
Oh,
imagination
yeah.
created this whole thing.
Yeah, and that's what makes these books stand out through all, like the test of time, and so it makes it so influential. Is just like how deep the lore of this world goes, and how far back all these characters go in their lineages, and even in their present moment, their families, what they do, where they live. It's like every setting has a huge description, and all the settings are different from each other. It's like, oh, you're on the steps of Credith Ungle, or oh, you're on the woods to Isengard, and he's able to describe with intense detail what that path looks like versus what those woods look like. I remember there was one point Faramir blindfolds them, and it's just a whole page. It's like of a solid paragraph, no breaks, describing their walking blindfolded. He's like, and then they were like started to descend, and he could feel the rocks. And I was like, oh my goodness, like how much did this guy visualize in his head before he set to write this down? And it's that idea of putting like these works of fantasy get life breathed into them when all these details are kind of worked into it, where it's not just I came up with this situation because it's a cool situation. It's like, no, this is like a inevitable long growing journey that we're on that's taken place over thousands of years. So it's just that kind of aspect to it that makes it so easy to kind of get lost in and enjoy.
Well, Charles, that's well eloquated for sure.
Thanks.
And I'm wondering, as you're talking about this, I know you're a huge Lord of the Rings enthusiast.
Hmm.
The This is your third read of the books,
Yeah.
right? And you've watched those movies countless
A bunch
times,
of
right?
times. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, do you feel like that's something that's missing from modern fantasy? When you read more modern works, are you feeling like you'd like to see people putting in more effort into fleshing out the entire iceberg instead of just the tip?
That's an interesting question. Um, and it brings like there's that next line in the C.S. Lewis review that says like none so relevant to the actual human situation yet free from allegory, and what fine shading there is in the variations of style to meet the almost endless diversity of scenes and characters. So I think that's this idea of like relevant to the human situation but free from allegory, to me, is what fantasy is and what makes fantasy really good. Tolkien just happened to be a guy who was passionate about settings and history and languages and the things that make for like this longer path. But what I say, like, do I wish there was more of that in modern fantasy? For the most part, what I like about modern fantasy is that it really explores that human situation, being completely removed from the physical, like literal humanity, like as it exists in real life.
For sure.
So that's what I really like to see, and why I love modern fantasy so much, and why reading George was such a influential moment, was this idea of putting a little more of that human conditioning into the story of like, hey, if a character as noble as so-and-so would exist in this world and they gave them a noble path, that person would just take advantage of it and kill you or something, you know? So it's like a very interesting ideas, and that's what has gotten me excited. Do you need to have all these things fleshed out to have a good fantasy book? I don't think so. You can tell when there's authors that are passionate about their world building. Like George put a ton of time and effort into Westeros, so it's like he has characters going back through all these time. He has maps. He's got, you know, different political parties and families, lineages. He's got all of that too. I think, but we don't necessarily need to read about it as so much. like for me, like as much as I love the Lord of the Rings books, I don't know if they would be my favorite fantasy books of all time. They're way up there, but a lot of what kind of holds it back for me is that dive into descriptions and languages and things. You know, a part of what makes someone like Sanderson so fresh is that they tell you what you need to know to get the story moving, and it's exciting, and there's consideration for entertaining the reader with every word in Sanderson's writing, whereas Tolkien's content to sit for a moment and go on about a certain place or a certain character for a long period of time. So I think all the best fantasy stories are going to have this whole world built in their minds, and that's what makes the moments that happen feel so lived in, that idea of the human situation. It's like you need a proper setting that allows for those kind of human situations to feel earned and lived in. So in that respect, yes. But in terms of like, and here's the iceberg as you go under the surface and it cascades down in this azure blue, and it's been here for hundreds of years. It's like, okay, what? Like, I don't need that part of it, but you can tell me that it's there, and it's, you know, put it into the story.
That's fair. And I was asking you because I thought maybe you'd be more inclined to this viewpoint that we need more world building and stuff than necessarily I am. I'm very character focused in terms of what kind of books I like to read.
Right.
And you are too, Charles. So maybe we're not the best examples of people who would die on the hill of world building.
Yeah. Like I find in
a
my
hill that has
personal
stood
life, I'm always
for
like,
hundreds of years, Charles, and was site to the great Battle of the Red Hill.
Yeah. I always find in my personal life, I'm like, can we make this shorter? How can we save time? How can we, get there in a more efficient way? I always have that kind of headspace just in life. So when I'm reading books, it really depends. It's whatever the author's passionate about. But if I was writing a book, it would not be anywhere near as descriptive as Tolkien's is. And because I'm just not a descriptive guy. But Tolkien makes you enjoy reading
Go
it.
on, Mr. Not Descriptive.
And that's that. I'm not very eloquated.
Well, you're making that point, clearly.
No, it's just I was going somewhere with that. It's just a good author should make you feel passionate about what they're passionate about, right? In Tolkien's case, describing settings and languages and things is what he's really into, and I enjoy reading it because I get that passion coming through. Same way that I enjoy reading something like Kingkiller's Chronicles, which, you know, he's got such a unique way of writing, and he's so focused on certain parts of, we're going back to this idea of the human situation, and I'm just all on board with that, and I love that for that, and I love Kingkillers for those reasons, separate from why I like Lord of the Rings. So it's just the author's voice being very strong in both
That's
cases.
fair, Charles. I think that's huge. Is the best books seem to come out of when authors write what they want to write.
Yeah.
And Tolkien was obviously very excited about his world and presenting it to people. And when someone's that excited, it's hard not to get at least a little bit excited too when you're reading it. And I was thinking, I've heard it said before in multiple places, this idea that basically everything you write, every scene, every interaction, basically every word, should in some way serve to advance the plot, advance character development, or both in a book. And I would say that Lord of the Rings does not necessarily adhere to that rule, and is pretty far from it when you compare it to something like Sanderson.
I would agree with that statement. Sometimes you flip a page in Lord of the Rings and you just see these super chunky paragraphs, and you're like, oh Lord, we're in it now. And it's usually not an action scene; it's usually a descriptive scene, which is fine. It's what you're reading Lord of the Rings, and you're in this new world, and it's so alive that it's never like a chore. But that's just what the experience of reading Lord of the Rings is like. It's like, does reading this huge description advance the plot or develop the characters in any way? No, but it sets the tone for Tolkien's whole world, and it breathes so much life into his world, and that's what makes those books so popular. Even though things aren't advancing constantly, it's like, this is a let's stop and take this in kind of experience.
For sure. And we do get the time to take things in the Two Towers.
Definitely.
There are a few scenes or events that had that same feeling I brought up around the Bombadil stuff
Really?
in our last episode, where I was like, oh, we're still doing this?
What scenes did you find to be...
The Ents.
Oh, man, I like the Ents, man. Treebeard's one of my favorite characters.
I mean, the idea of the Ents in some ways is that they live really long, so they take their time with things, and
I like their language. They're always like, ho hum, don't be so hasty, because they're trees and they're like have lived for thousands of years. Yeah. It's like, you're talking too fast for me to understand you. It's like, I'm a tree, right? Like, I take hundreds of years to grow. So it's like, and it's like, oh, what's your word for that? Hill? What a hasty way to say something that's been forming for thousands of years. This word hill, which when I read that, I was like, what a fun perspective that is. And I always liked Treebeard, man. He's so fun. He's like trying to learn about hobbits, and then he's like they have that whole super long meeting. They're like, we're decided you're not orcs. It's like, oh God, we're going to be here for quite a while, So the moments like that I thought were really fun.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have complaints or these anti-Treebeard takes to lay on you, Charles. I think sometimes I can just get a little bit impatient. I'm not a tree. I'm a person. I got only so much time,
hasty.
Charles.
You're so hasty.
I'm hasty. Yeah, I don't know what to say.
You could perhaps, C.S. Lewis might say you're adhering too much to your individual psychology.
My entire life is about individual psychology. So I would not be surprised if I'm falling into being too entrenched in the idea of individual psychology, as that's what I
And
study.
that's a huge reason why I never really pushed these books on you over the years. I was never like, dude, don't talk to me until you've read Lord of the Rings. Or I never was like, you have to read Lord of the Rings. I was always like, I like them. I recommend you read them. But you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I never felt like I pushed them at any moment or said you would
Never.
love these. I never tried to hype them up for you. And a lot of it is for that reason. I was actually relieved a bit from our last episode that you had liked it as much as you did in the last episode. I was like, oh, thank goodness, because a part of me thought you weren't going to get much out of the experience from all the descriptions and the songs and the poetry and kind of these almost like I'm trying to come up with the right word for these kinds of characters like Treebeard, where it's not silly, but they're just kind of like whimsical, like whatever that word is, where they're just like fun characters that aren't necessarily like contemplating the human condition or anything like that. They're not faced with these like morally ambiguous dilemmas. Everything is very much good and evil, and the good characters are super good, and they're eloquent, and they're verbose, and they're not that kind of conflict that I know you kind of like to go for, and they're not that complex in terms of their psychology, which is what I know you're looking for as well.
I do love a character with some inner turmoil. And
Treebeard is not that character.
Not a lot of inner turmoil going on for Treebeard.
But he did have that moment where he's like, these trees were my friends.
There was that moment.
He had to decide to go to battle. He's like, oh, I'm getting a little hasty myself.
That does happen. Well, I'll say something that I did really appreciate in the Two Towers was that we got a lot more Schmeagol or Gollum. I don't know what the proper way to refer to him is among actual big
It depends on what mood he's in, I guess. Gollum, Schmeagol. I'll just call him Gollum. It's a cooler name.
Yeah, well, I'll go Gollum then. I appreciate that we got a lot more time with Gollum because definitely holds up as my favorite character in anything I've experienced Lord of the Rings wise.
Oh yeah, the Gollum moments really shine in this.
I mean, I said there were a few times where I would start to like, oh yeah, like we're still doing this, and every time we would get some Gollum scenes and some dialogue with Gollum and him and Sam going back and forth at each other. I was way more alert.
One of the things I loved about this book was those voices. Like to read Gollum, it's hard to think that character was written like in the 50s or even earlier when Tolkien was working really hard on it. They were published in the 50s, but it's like that character is so fresh and so individual and so unique, and reading him, he just pops off the pages where he's like, my precious Gollum. I think that writing was a huge influence for Andy Serkis, who plays Gollum in the movies, where it's like he did such a fantastic job of bringing that voice onto the screen. It's just how it was written it's written exactly like he portrays it to me almost. It's like that kind of conflicted language where he's constantly like sputtering, saying weird things. Like he goes in and out of being like this kind of manic, more Gollum than Schmeagol, more Schmeagol than Gollum. He's like going back and forth. Such a fun character to read. And that's what I liked about Treebeard also, these different voices, these voices so far and away from what a normal human being would sound like. It's like these totally fresh original takes on like brand new creatures, because like elves and dwarves and men, they all kind of speak the same, but Gollum speaks in a totally bizarre way. It's like really, really interesting. Such a great character.
What's incredible is that even looking back now, there's nothing about Gollum that I feel like has been replicated to the extent where he doesn't hold up as well as he'd like to. I
Right.
know he
There's no
talked
like
about,
Gollum trope.
yeah, it's like I'm sure it's been replicated
There's like
many
characters that
times
repeat their names like over and over
Mhm.
and stuff, and they are kind of silly or unhinged in some way. But
Yeah,
yeah, Gollum lives in his own. He's such a unique character.
for sure. And it's amazing that no one's really been able to capture that Gollum bit or even really like expand upon it, right? There's ways, I don't want to spoil anything in Joe Abercrombie's work, but there's just ways in which you can see him giving his own take on certain characters. I guess I could say without it really this being a spoiler that the way that Joe Abercrombie presents Baez is kind of a different take on the wizard archetype that Gandalf is basically the
That's
person that
fair. Yeah.
all of this is based on. And I won't say in what ways Baez differs, but very much so in a way that's very clearly a subversion and a twist on something that Gandalf was, that feels like it takes things in a different direction that's interesting and kind of expands upon, standing on the shoulders of giants type of thing.
Right.
But I don't see these places where people have really stood on Tolkien's shoulders and been able to see farther down the Gollum path. And
Yeah.
Gollum holds up so well.
Gollum
Still so
holds
interesting.
up better than a lot of characters in this. He's just so unique, and the whole situation that the hobbits are in with Gollum is an interesting one as well, where they're like, we need him, he's our guide, but he's also like basically like a feral animal at the same time. So it's and we can't really trust him, and he might be treacherous, and Sam doesn't trust him at all, and Frodo
Yeah.
like is more compassionate. So like the whole dynamic between the three of them is super interesting, and then they're like obligated to protect him when they run into Faramir. So it's like a lot of really interesting. Like he's got some innocence to him as well, while also being the furthest thing from innocent. It's like really, he's such an interesting character. He's got a lot going on, and he's used in almost every conceivable way. He's portrayed in every way as a human being could be portrayed. He's crazy, but he's conniving, and he has like quips, and but he's also innocent, but he's also plotting their deaths. It's like really bizarre.
Yeah. I have no idea how Tolkien was able to conceive a character
Yeah, when
like
you think of like a
Gollum.
professor in like the 40s and the 30s, like
Yeah.
trying to write fiction, you wouldn't think they'd come up with a character like Gollum who's very off the beaten path.
Well, very much holds up, and as someone who'd only watched the movies and now was reading these books for the first time, to see how clear and distinct Gollum's voice is in the books and how much it was pretty much just taken directly by Andy Serkis, like you were saying,
Yeah.
Charles. I think that we were talking about in our last episode how Gimli, for example, in the books maybe doesn't seem to have as much voice or charisma as we felt like the actor. What's his name?
Oh, I
Charles, do you
can't
know? Sorry to
say
put you
it.
on the
I
spot
do
if
know
you.
it, but I don't know how to pronounce it. It's like I'm gonna butcher it. Let me just Google
Either way,
it.
I mean, I'll let you Google if you
It's
want
like
to, and I'll
Reese
say.
Jarvis, or it's like Reese something.
Anyway, he's a great actor in that,
John
and
Reese
he.
Davis, Rhys Davies, John Reese Davies.
John, if you're listening, sorry if we're mispronouncing,
He's a
but
fantastic actor.
you do an awesome job, John, portraying Gimli, and you bring so much flavor to that role. And I feel like reading the books after watching the movies, where Gimli was one of my favorite characters, I was kind of like, took some of the fun out of what he was.
Right.
And or just like it didn't seem to have the same amount of fun. And
Totally agree.
Gollum, there was no part of me that was like, oh, Gollum just isn't the same without seeing Andy
Yeah, the
Serkis.
book character lives up to the movie character more
Hmm.
in more ways than many of the other cast members have lived up to their characters. I mean, they all do fantastic jobs, and some do better than the book version. But that was one where it's like two amazing. Like the book version and the movie version are just both like top tier portrayals of a very unique character. They just nailed it.
For
What
sure.
did you think of? Because in the movies, what happens is Gollum like kind of frames Sam as like having eaten all their food, and then Frodo like takes Gollum's side and abandons Sam.
Oh
Whereas in
yeah.
the books, Frodo and Sam stay together till the end when they just get separated because Frodo runs. He's so excited to be out in the exit, he just like sprints off, and they get separated.
What did I think about that
The
as a
different, like the
difference
choice, the
between?
creative choice, and like does one succeed more than the other, kind of a thing. Because it is a
Well,
really deliberate departure from what Tolkien
yeah.
wrote to be like, and then Frodo loses trust in Sam and decides to walk away. It's like that
Mm.
interesting.
I don't think that was necessarily an improvement. I think the books probably do this a little bit stronger. The thing about the movies I really liked is I felt like they captured that moment where Gollum is saved by Frodo at the Forbidden Pool
Yeah,
in a way that felt like it drilled home why Gollum would then betray them and this whole thing. I feel like the movie set that up really well, but the decision to then have it be that Frodo loses trust in Sam and stuff like that, I could take or leave that bit. And I like this. I like the bromance between Frodo and Sam. I think better in the books than I do in the movies. Though they do it well in the movies.
they
I think
do.
it's a little bit stronger because you don't have these weird moments where it's like, wait, this one small thing that Sam did
Sam ate all
has
the
you.
lambus bread, even though he
Yeah,
denies it. I don't believe him, and I'm
I
leaving
believe
now.
the
Yeah,
I believe the corrupted gray thing that keeps talking to itself instead of Sam, my like lifelong friend or servant or whatever is going on there. That's still kind of creeping me out, the whole master thing.
yeah. I think that's just like old school.
Yeah.
The idea that like he was his gardener, so Frodo's the master. It's like something that doesn't really fly in a modern Americana, but in ye old England, I'm sure it's not a huge deal. And Sam doesn't seem bothered by it at all, and
No.
um, not language that I would use, but it is unusual to read that. It's also unusual to read things like Frodo. You rested his head in his lap, and they were like holding hands and stuff. You're like, yeah, it's a different take on this idea of their relationship. Like today, people would be like, "Are they a couple?" But I think it was very much written in like a like we're at the edge of the world and we're the only two good things just in this whole land, and we're just holding on to each other. So
Mm.
very interesting.
Yeah, I think it's a very this isn't going to be a huge take that no one's ever said before, but I think that the Sam Frodo relationship does a good job of portraying just that really genuine, loyal friendship in a way that maybe is being subverted so much at this point
Right.
that
It's such like
it's
an
nice to see
honest,
it done
vulnerable moment,
uncynically.
because it's not like they're always like that. This was just one moment that Tolkien wrote in towards the end of this book where they were like, um, it was almost they were just kind of like embracing each other more as they were approaching the gates of Mordor, right? So it just was really interesting. I always envisioned what it would be like if you were like sharing a foxhole with someone in World War One, and you thought you could die at any moment, kind of a thing. And it's just like you have that bond between you. It's not romantic, but it is love. And it's just something that Lord of the Rings, that relationship between Sam and Frodo, that I've always really liked, that you don't really get a lot of in more modern stuff, is this idea of this kind of this vulnerable love between these two people that's not necessarily romantic or subverted in any way. It's just like two people at the edge of the world, so like overwhelmed with grief and impending doom. Like they think they're going to die. You know, they don't see how they could possibly survive this. They're not even worried about getting fresh water anymore. They're like, well, we'll worry about that if we ever make it like through the gates. Like if we run out of water, that's the least of our problems right now. So those kinds of moments, you're like, whoa, they are in the thick of it. So those moments I thought were really touching and fresh for me. But I imagine it would be very common in like fields of war or something.
Well, the closest that we have ever gotten to that, Charles, is probably when we climb Mount Doom.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. And, hey, there's something we can relate to there. And
I can totally relate
setting.
to Sam and Frodo's plight. You know, instead of Lambus, we had Cranberry Delish.
And instead of Gollum, we had Derek.
Absolutely. Dude, what a great that trip was more metaphorical than I thought.
Yeah. You know, we visit Middle Earth, we climb Mount Doom, and we're basically, well, who's Sam and who's Frodo then?
Oh, that's a good question. It could go either way, honestly. You know, some days I feel like the Frodo, other days I feel like the Sam. In that situation, seeing as I was the one that came closest to death,
Frodo.
I would be the Frodo.
Yeah. All we know for sure is that Derek was gone.
You were like, I don't trust this Derek guy. I don't know why he had to come with us.
I was always saying.
It could have just been the two of us, you know. It's funny.
Yeah, well, that's a plug, I guess. If you want to hear us self-indulgently talk more about our trip to New Zealand and to see the Middle Earth stuff, then we will be releasing.
That's coming out in a few days, actually. So that Mount Doom trip one is the next episode after this one. So this is a Sunday episode, and that's a Wednesday.
Oh.
Yep.
Wow.
Our first one came out last Wednesday.
You're right about that, Charles.
Yeah, I'm right about it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. You are the dachshund of the...
Thank you. I mean, we did plan it that way, right? That was the whole point of these things.
For sure, yeah. I just... You know, as the Kelsier of the two of us here, you know...
You're just happy it all worked out at the end.
I just got to be the face of this thing, and I'm glad that you're there to make sure that all this stuff is actually being released.
Yeah, no worries. Oh man, there's so much more to talk about here. One of the other characters that I really liked, I'd say after Treebeard and Gollum, another character that for me had a really strong presence in this book was Faramir. I'm a big Faramir fan, and I'd say he would be home in any modern fantasy story.
I felt like Faramir in the books was one of the biggest improvements over the movies, I guess. It's hard to use the word improvement about something that came before.
Yeah.
One of the things that sticks out as substantially better than in the movies, I feel like, I don't know.
We had a lot more time with Faramir. Those conversations between Frodo and Faramir and like the interrogation almost. It was a conversation where Faramir was basically testing like how much is Frodo for real or is he some sort of evil? Like what does he know? How much information can I get out of him? And Frodo's like, I can't tell him about the ring because it's too tempting. So they have this back and forth trying to withhold information and only give out as much information so that they can trust each other. And Faramir's approach to it is so interesting and so fresh after reading a lot of the Lord of the Rings series up to this point. Like every character is very like virtuistic and almost kind of like doesn't even matter who else is in the room. They'll just say something and it will be so right and so true. And Faramir's one where he's like, yeah, my dad would probably want me to take this, and I know Boromir wanted it, but I gotta stay true to the logical thing to do. And there was a good line when they were departing where it was either Sam or something where he was like, oh, some people are more like elves or whatever, but you're more like a wizard. It's because the way he had his critical mind on, and he made an unpopular choice, but he knew it was the right thing to do just objectively. And I don't think that had enough time to play out in the movies. And in the movies, it just seems like a worse Boromir.
That's
He's
literally
very much a
what I was
sad
going
child.
to say, Charles.
Yeah.
I was literally going to say worse Boromir is my memory of Faramir from the movies. And I'm looking at a picture right now on Google Images of I don't know the actor who played Faramir.
We're gonna go through this again.
I mean,
I actually don't know the guy's name for this one. David Wenham.
Sure, and he's next to Sean Bean in this picture. And they made his hairstyle, his facial hair, all this stuff basically exactly the same as Boromir. And I don't know, there's just something about the way that Sean Bean's kind of holding himself that makes him look so much more badass and cooler.
Yeah, there's a funny gif
Faramir.
in that was like one of the extended scenes in the movies where Denethor, their dad, is like he's just having this like dream vision of Boromir, and he's all smiley and happy, and then all of a sudden like Faramir fades in and Boromir fades out, and he has like this shocked, disgusted, disappointed look on his face. It's so funny. It's just
it's a weird route that they went.
It was just like economy of
with...
how much time can we develop this character versus other characters.
I'm glad we got to see the version of him in the books because he comes off in a lot of ways as a more level-headed or like with more, I guess, self-restraint version of Boromir.
Right.
In the books.
Exactly.
And it's like, oh, that's so cool to see a person representing the humans in this who gets to be this pragmatic but restrained voice.
Right. And
besides
restraint
Aragorn,
is the word of it. And that's what made him so interesting. This book is so full of these epic characters, and this is like, I'm the second born. I'm not like the grandiose hero. And there's more than just being like noble and true. There's like, well, you have to be kind of realistic about these things, right? You have to be like pragmatic and like,
as the great Logan Ninefingers said.
Yeah, exactly. And every Kelsier needs a dachshund, so he and Faramir is very much that, like, he's not charismatic enough to be Boromir, but he is certainly pragmatic enough to be a good leader. It's just a different take on it, and that's what made Faramir so interesting, and all those scenes where they're together were so much fun for me to read.
Agreed. The FTF podcast is very pro Faramir.
We are pro Faramir. We're pro Gollum. We're on the fence about Treebeard. I wish we were more pro Treebeard than we
split.
are, but we have to, we can't agree on everything.
Yeah.
But let's talk some more about the first half of this book, because the book splits itself very clearly. I mean, Tolkien wrote 6 books, and then they got grouped into, 3 books. So in the Two Towers, we have 2 separate books, and they were originally going to be called, let's see if I have it in my notes here. Yes. So one was supposed to be called The Treason of Isengard, and the other one was The Ring Goes East. Was the name of the other one. And then Tolkien has gone on the record of being like, as finding a title that would come as close as possible to connecting these 2 super different books, we chose the two towers, and even then he's like, well, there's like 6 different towers in these books, so it's like it's not clear which 2 they are. Although Tolkien does go later on the record to say the 2. It's Isengard, and then it's Cridith Minas Morgul, I should say. Minas Morgul, the one that the lead ring wraith like comes out of, that Frodo and Sam are watching that army march towards Gondor. That's that tower. So those are the 2 towers, basically.
Gotcha. Yeah, they split up. There's the is the treason of Isengard spelt like tree beard?
TREE space SON. That would be epic.
I assume it was named for the amount of time spent with the Ents.
I love the Ents, man. In the movies too, they have a great line in the movies that I thought was in the books, but it isn't. Where it's like, I always loved going south. Feels like going downhill. That idea, it's like such like a thought a tree would have. You know, it's just like, don't be so hasty. I just love that idea. And then the fact that they just go to war and overthrow Saruman. I love that scene where, you know, the trio, right? Aragorn, Legolas, Gimli, they are searching for Merry and Pippin, and they do this I really like the way this series kicks off, where, you know, Boromir dies, Frodo's gone, and they're just like, the Fellowship has failed. All we can do now is try and save who we can, which was Merry and Pippin, which I thought was kind of a noble thing to do. And they go on that epic long run over days, which is another cool thing that happens in these books. The first time they see them, they're walking up with Gandalf, and they're smoking on like the steps of Isengard, being like, "Oh, hi guys."
that was one of the better scenes in this thing, I think.
Yeah, it's like, you want,
because it's described in a way where it's like they saw 2 like figures lying down,
and then Gimli's like, "You are here. We find you here, smoking and eating." It's just. It was one of the few moments of genuine like charm and humor that these books kind of allowed, which I thought were so good. I love those moments. In the movies too, they're really fun too. Where it's like, we ran for days. We thought you were dead, and here we find you. And they're smoking old Toby. Funny. And of course they're being like kind of cheeky that whole time. It's just very fun.
It's interesting that what Tolkien wanted to do was split things up kind of the way that George split up characters into different books with parallel timelines.
That's true.
Going on.
Very Georgian.
So Tolkien was probably like...
It's funny how he keeps saying like, oh, it's a very George-like of him. Meanwhile, he wrote these books 40 years before George.
True. I guess it's just funny to think... It's similar to what George would later
like, oh, what an
actually
interesting take that was different from the movies. So I think you gotta step back and be like, dude, this guy, there was nothing, and then there was that. This is kind of what it feels like in terms of modern fantasy. It's like, look, this is what, before this we had fairy tales and folklore and stuff.
Well, I was trying to say that he was probably pitching it like, all right, we'll get Gimli and Gandalf, and we'll get Legolas in this one. Make sure to get a lot of Treebeard time, and then the other one it's mostly Bombadil. But
I can't believe you're comparing anything that happens in this to Bombadil. Bombadil
no, the other one's
so extreme. At least Treebeard went on to fight Saruman, and like.
There's also, I'm probably gonna get heat for this, huh? If I go too far. There was also a pitch to book 7 that was exclusively Shelob.
Are you serious?
No, but it is funny when it's very like old school fantasy. I'm not even criticizing. I just think it's like interesting to look back on, where Sam basically defeats Shelob, and I did enjoy getting kind of more background on that character so that you get to,
Yeah, Tolkien did
I
a
don't know, in the
great job of weaving
movies.
in explaining who Shelob is while also
Yeah,
keeping that scene mysterious and scary. It's like
for sure.
really well done way to explain a new character while also keeping the progress of the horror of not knowing what's happening. Like fantastic.
Extremely well done, and my memory of what that was adapted to be like in the movies is just like, okay, now a spider thing's attacking them. Okay, I guess this is happening now. Maybe there's more than that, but that's
But
just my
it
memory.
also gives mad props to Sam, which the movie doesn't do as much. Where it's like, and then for the first time in its immortal life, it was wounded, and then the orcs are like,
Yeah.
there's some super strong
Yeah.
warrior about here
Yeah.
that was able
They're like
to.
probably an elf, like some super strong elf warrior
Yeah, like we gotta
probably.
leave before he gets here.
Yeah. It's just Sam.
Yeah.
Gardener extraordinaire.
Sam's really growing into his own here.
Yeah. No, there's there's an epicness, I don't know if that's a word, to the way that the fight scene with Shelob is written that
Truly.
is really cool. Just the description of Sam, it's like Sam charged with like more, I don't know if it was like anger or whatever,
Right.
but it's like more force than like anyone in the world. That's kind of the way it was described.
It is more
And
old
it's like,
school. Instead of like getting the blow by blow, which Tolkien never does,
yeah,
like the Battle of Helm's Deep was not a blow by blow thing, and neither was
not at
this.
all.
It's very much he's focusing more on like overcoming these emotional odds and the change in your character and what you focused on, you know?
It's
It gives it like
so
an epic old school vibe to it, and the language of it is so intense. Like the words he chooses are very intense.
definitely, and it's cool seeing Sam wound, I guess, Shelob, and to feel like holy crap when it happens. And I didn't necessarily feel that when I watched the movie, where I was just like, okay, like spiders attacking, like dealing with this now. So that's
Oh,
pretty
here's a quote.
cool.
But almost before she, being Shelob, was aware that a fury was upon her greater than any she had known in
Yes,
countless years, the shining sword bit upon her foot and shore away the claw. And then there's one, no onslaught more fierce was ever seen in the savage world of beasts, where some desperate small creature armed with little teeth alone will spring upon a tower of horn and hide that stands above its fallen mate. Which it's
that's
like
exactly what I was referring to.
reading
Yeah.
those lines, you're like, whoa, what is happening right now? It's so much better than like, and bones were crunching, and he swung his sword, and it met purchase on a, on the, on the exposed armor, which is also cool, but
Different strokes for different folks.
true. This brought me back to like Helm's Deep, which was my favorite. I mean, the Mines of Moria in the first book, which was my favorite scene, and this Shelob's Lair is another one of my favorite scenes. Tolkien writes some great, almost horror to it. I just thought both the Mines of Moria and this, just these scenes really came alive. With Tolkien, a guy who doesn't write that much action, when he gets into it, it's super good. I was like, you could make a whole book where just this crazy stuff happening to people, but he's very restrained in when he has those moments of like, here's something super intense going down.
It's interesting to see the contrast and the willingness to like contrast from this, where things kind of started, to where we're at now with the modern fantasy, more blow by blow fight scenes.
Right.
And just these moments like after Sam wounds Shelob, where there's the lines that Tolkien writes something like, but whether she like restored herself and then went on to do more bad stuff, well, this tale isn't about that. It's like, yep. And most people, if the tale wasn't about it, in modern fantasy, would not have
Yeah.
wrote that the tale isn't about it. They'd just keep moving.
Right.
But I don't know. There's charm to seeing
Yeah, there's something
that.
about those like old school things where it's very much a fairy tale. It's like, and then they went on to whatever, and it's like, but not our thing, right? It's like this character did went on to do other stuff, maybe, who knows. So no, I Shelob was one of my top scenes. That whole Shelob's Lair chapter. It's right at the end too. And then the way this book ends, where it's just like Sam finds out Frodo's alive. Like I can't imagine like reading like this book just came out and you're reading that, you're like, Frodo's dead, whoa, and it's like Frodo's alive and he's captured by orcs, and then the book ends. It's like, well, guess I'm waiting till next year to find out like how this
How
whole
far
thing
apart
ends.
were these
I
published?
think they were published a year apart, I want to say it, but I'm
Good on
honestly
Tolkien.
he like wrote them all, and then the question was how they were gonna bind them together and release them.
Very Abercrombie of him.
Yeah.
To throw back. He must have been drawing from his influences, like Joe Abercrombie, who also writes all.
It's very Abercrombiean of him. He has a lot of Georgisms and Abercrombieisms in him.
Yeah, it's you gotta draw from the greats.
Yeah.
And
it's amazing that he's doing all the things that these current authors are doing,
For sure. No, it's funny because some of these things that Tolkien was doing back then, I think people moved away from and then started to realize, hey, maybe it is a good idea.
I had another funny thought when I finished this book. I was like, well, this is very much like Empire Strikes Back. This is like very Empire of this trilogy. And I was like, wait, this came out like 20 years before Empire?
Yeah.
This idea of like the middle chapter being the one that ends in this defeatist style, where kind of like Empire Strikes Back, where it's like, spoiler alert to anyone that hasn't seen Empire Strikes Back, where he loses the duel to Darth Vader and loses a hand, and Han Solo gets frozen, and then it just ends, and it's like a downer. That's very much what's happened here. It's like Frodo's being taken away by orcs. He's incapacitated, and Sam is all by himself, has nobody, and that's just how this ends. And it's such a crazy way to go out. It's I don't know, it's what makes these so epic and so like standing the test of time, and how so many other works of fiction have built on that pacing of it and the story structure. I mean, Tolkien didn't even intend to make it a trilogy, and yet it's still wove into this like beautiful story pattern that a lot of people, when they're publishing or making movies now, it's like even like Avengers, like the Avengers Infinity War, where it ended and it was like disastrous. Oh, spoilers for Avengers if you haven't seen Avengers Infinity War. But that had an ending very much like Empire and very much like Two Towers, and then you have the final one where it's like, what kind of book is it where all the main characters actually lose, but you do have those moments. And that's what modern fantasy spins that a little bit. But
it's interesting to think that there could be people out there who, because they are listening to the tiny Friends Talking Fantasy podcast, and haven't.
Could you imagine if I spoiled Star Wars or
I know
or Infinity War to someone?
Well, I'm just thinking of like, I don't want to call anyone out. We're thankful for any listeners, and we're honored if you got around to listening to this episode of the FTF podcast before getting around to Avengers Infinity War getting around to Empire Strikes Back from Star Wars. We are surprised, though.
Yeah, we are surprised, but we are very grateful. And yeah, I mean, what a great like middle story to a great trilogy. Honestly, I like this book a lot more than The Fellowship. For me, The Fellowship, especially in the beginning, dragged so heavily. And while you could say there's moments in these that felt kind of draggy in terms of like going into description and stuff, it has some great action pieces, and it moves the story in a lot less words, and I don't know, to me it's building up. Like the stakes are so much higher now. The idea of Shelob's Lair and Faramir and Treebeard, like these are all characters that I really loved, and just a great great piece of fiction, and it's like in 150,000 words, no less. I mean, Game of Thrones was almost twice that amount, so it's crazy to think how influential
That's
just that.
the first book.
Yeah, just the first book
A
was
Game of Thrones.
298,000 words was according to the internet, whereas the Two Towers was 156,000, so just under double. Fellowship of the Ring was 187,000. I feel like if you took out the Bombadil stuff, though, you'd be back at around 150,000 words.
Yeah, but why would you do that, Charles?
You got to give something to the book fans, There's really nothing for book fans in Two Towers, A lot of it was adapted to movie.
Like really caring about Shelob, I feel like would be a
but
book fan
Shelob's
thing
in
to do.
the. But to know exactly who Shelob is, like how epic of a creature Shelob is. Like the feat of defeating Shelob is a huge deal that you have no idea how huge of a deal it is for Sam in the movies, where it's like, oh, Sam beat a big spider
thing.
But it's like, Sam beat Shelob, bro. Like, he beat
exactly
like, the personification of evil, and like the second most evil thing in the land besides like Sauron. Sauron's cat basically was, I think, how they said it in the description. So it's like, dude, it's serious stuff. Like something that never like was stabbed before just got stabbed. So it's like, it's one of those. That's this book Sam is so epic in that way. And movie Sam did all the same stuff. You just don't know it.
You know what's interesting for me reading this book too is that there are a lot of meta moments almost that you wouldn't expect from Tolkien. like that they. So there's moments where Frodo and Sam are talking about like the point in the story they're at.
Yes. That's a great moment where he's like, I want to hear the story of Mr. Frodo or whatever. And it's like, what about that Sam guy? It's like, well, they don't know that they're in the story when they're in it, So, those are.
Yeah, but Tolkien knows he's writing a story.
Yeah, well.
I think. I mean, unless he's so lost in it. But I don't know. He was writing. I mean, he had meta things. I mean, the Hobbit is basically supposed to be written by Bilbo, right?
Yeah, basically.
Like, and then he's writing his story in the Lord of the Rings series. I mean, Tolkien was meta before it was cool.
He was. And, I think people have gone on to be like, how can we take that idea of talking about story structure and the point we're at in the story and take my story, but break those rules and expectations and things? How extreme can we go with it?
Yeah.
Well,
but
and there's a great
Tolkien
quote in there too.
Ahead of his time. I did enjoy that conversation. Besides the interest I was getting out of people in a story talking about their story being told in something as old as this.
Yeah, and there's a point where it's like, I wonder what sort of tale we've fallen into, was something that Sam asked to Frodo. And Frodo's like, I wonder, but I don't know. And that's the way of a real tale. It's like that whole conversation where it's, I bet Tolkien was a bit of a silly guy in real life. He had to have been.
I would guess that he was.
He must have been fun.
Well, Charles, maybe the one thing we didn't talk about is Helm's Deep. That maybe we should. I mean,
in the movies, it's epic. And even like when season 8 of Game of Thrones came out, they're like, this battle will be longer and more epic than Helm's Deep. It's like, that's up for debate. But in the books,
it was darker.
It was. Got him. I mean, looking at Helm's Deep, where it's like super blue and bright, like it's in a studio, but it's Helm's Deep stands on its own in terms of movie battles, but and to compare it to Helm's Deep was such a bold move that did not pay off. But anyway, in the books, it does kind of they do that thing that you were asking about in the last book of like doing the body count thing between Gimli and Legolas, which was fun, and that's a fun thing that came out in the movies. But it was really breezed over, and that's kind of what we were
I
talking
felt
about
that.
earlier. Of like Tolkien doesn't really write action. Like this book is only 150,000 words long, and so many things happen. I just think his economy of words, it's like this huge epic battle that was a third of the movie, is a couple pages in my story. I'm spending more time describing other things.
Well, I'm sure it was more than a couple pages, but
It was a
maybe I'm
chapter,
wrong.
but it wasn't like the
But
percentage dedicated to like the battle in the movies versus dedicated
for
to
sure,
pages of the book is they're way skewed from each other.
it's a big difference, and I was pretty surprised
Mm-hmm.
by that. I was amazed that Peter Jackson and everyone else who worked on that were able to see what they made of Helm's Deep in what Tolkien wrote.
So
That's
true.
pretty incredible that they carved that
So true.
out of that whole thing. I feel like the Gimli and Legolas stuff, which is so fun and action packed in the movies. In the book, it's almost just like they'll see each other every once in a while and be like, "Hey, dude, where you at?" It's like, "I'm at 42. What about you?" He's like, 39. It's like, "Oh, cool. Well, see you later." While in the movies, it was like, I just shot one, and I'll say
41,
I'm at
42.
41. Yeah,
Yeah, I can see that. And I mean, those guys that made the movie, they were brilliant editors. I don't know how they thought to expand what they thought to expand and condense or remove the things they thought to condense and remove, but they did a job that I would have never thought possible. And I would have never considered making Helm's Deep like a huge deal as it was made in the movies, but it's such a fantastic moment that made those movies as successful as they were. And I mean, Tolkien did what he was good at, and Peter Jackson and his team did what they were good at. They wanted to flex more of their special effects, and they wanted to do a battle, and Helm's Deep was a great opportunity for that. And it is that dramatic moment where at the 11th hour, Gandalf arrives with the sunrise, and they come down, and King Theoden's like, we'll ride together. Like, because there's a point where they're just totally overrun, and they're barricaded the doors, and they realize, like, what are we going to do? Wait for them to bust in? Why don't we just ride out there in like a blaze of glory? And it just happened to be that 11th hour moment of, Gandalf is here and saved us all. So, which you can get away with in Lord of the Rings. It's not considered a trope at this point. It's kind of, it seems like Gandalf has returned and he's back and he's more powerful, which has become ultra mega trope. That Gandalf character has been done 1,000 million times. The idea of returning, like thinking that they died and coming back.
for
And
sure.
even before Gandalf, that was done in fiction, but like Gandalf was that modern fantasy example of it that was super popular.
Set the stage for a lot of resurrections that have frustrated many, many people who
So many
feel
people
like
shouting
it takes
trope
away.
at others. So many Tolkien clones that we've had to wade through since.
Yeah, well, resurrection's an interesting topic. I'd almost think that could be a fun thing for us to talk about more.
Yeah, like
as its
a
own
character series of
segment.
like best and worst resurrected characters.
Yeah,
It's like, here's a character that had no business being resurrected.
I've read some. I mean, because it has the chance to be this really epic moment, but most of the time I feel like it just takes away stakes from
Yeah, I mean, it
the.
takes a lot of guts to kill the main character or a main character. Like to kill Gandalf was like a huge deal, and then to bring him back somehow managed to be pulled off as a huge deal as well. It's not an easy thing to do,
It's not easy, and
especially
most of
now
the
that
time,
Gandalf exists.
yeah, most of the time you're gonna probably fall flat. My general blanket statement recommendation for resurrection would be don't do it,
Yeah.
but I mean, it can definitely be done well. I
That's
think so much of it is
also like a
about-
modern fantasy approach to things
Mhm.
would be like to hope that they would get resurrected. It's like, no, dude, they're dead. Like, spoilers. I'm not even going to say it, but we reviewed a series a while back that had this resurrection trope in it, and it was subverted in a good way. Dylan, I'm hoping you're remembering what I'm talking about.
Yeah, it's not a huge.
It's not huge, but it
Well,
was
yeah,
a
I get what
main
you're saying.
character went out in a blaze of glory,
Yes,
and there was a play on the resurrection trope, you know?
for sure.
And I don't know how
think we
appropriate that would
haven't
be to
covered that
bring up
many
in
No,
this, but
no. But it is moments like Gandalf's resurrection that set the stage. And we haven't covered that many books, by the way. So if you look back and you've read the books, you probably know which one we're talking about, too.
yeah, but it's not
But
enough
anyway,
that
yeah.
I spoiled anything for anybody.
No. And yeah, it's resurrections like this that set the stage for for being able to subvert it like that. And the stage has been thoroughly set
Thoroughly
for and for Return of the King too. Now
That's
that
right.
we're closing out Two Towers here.
Closing it out, man. These series, you get a sense of it. Oh, there goes Siri. you get a sense that's like the third or fourth time now. We gotta just do a running count when my Siri gets turned on.
Charles, since you're the dachshund over here, you'll know whether or not Friends Pitching Fantasy has aired by now. The last one, right?
So there's one that we recorded that's coming out after Mistborn. So yes, there's this one. The only other one we've recorded will have aired by now.
You mean after King Killer?
Yeah, King Killer.
Okay. So you'll know already, friends of friends, that's you, the listeners, that we will be covering Witcher next. And
Yes.
I'm very excited for all the moments where Charles has to discuss Princess Ciri
Oh Lord.
and his phone
I'm just gonna
freaks
turn
out.
my phone off, or maybe I'll keep it on and we'll do a running count.
That would be a funny running count.
But and that would also be interesting to compare it and see just like the character Geralt versus a character like in Aragon
Like
or
Aragon,
a Faramir
yeah.
type would compare.
Yeah, I mean, I'm very excited to get into Witcher. I know we're a
But
little
before
ahead
we
of
do
ourselves
that, we
here.
have the grand finale of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. Who knows where it's gonna go?
Anything can happen.
Anything can happen. Frodo's been taken away by orcs, dude, into Mount Doom. Not into Mount Doom, into Mordor. So he is in some serious trouble, and Sam is in despair.
Well said, Charles.
So I
And
think
we eagerly await.
we eagerly
What will
await.
happen,
I mean, this
yeah.
is the climactic, poetic, epic finale to one of the most influential works of fiction ever published in the modern times.
And you can expect one of the most influential episodes of a podcast ever.
We're going to have opinions on it. We're going to have thoughts, ideas, opinions, discussions. You're not going to
We
want to
will.
miss it.
Don't miss it.
Don't miss it. Is there anything else, Dylan, you would want to say about the Two Towers before we go forward into our Return of the King buddy read?
No, I think we've said it all.
I mean, there's so many other moments that happened in these books, but I'm happy with where we are. And with that, I think I'm just going to get our outro queued up here. So thank you, everyone, for listening to yet another exciting, epic episode of the Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast. My name is Charles. With me, as always, is my friend Dylan.
That's me.
That's him right there. Do us a favor. Check us out. Check out our other episodes. Visit us on social media. Send us an email. Just Google Friends Talking Fantasy Podcast and click all those links. Rate 5 stars. share with your friends, all that other stuff. Let's go, team. Friends, Talking Fantasy team, FTFers out there.
Hands in.
Hands in.
FTF podcast on 3, Charles.
All right, FTF on 3.
1, 2, 3.
Friends Talking
FTF.
Fantasy. Should we try that again? Nah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I feel like we might not have time.
you guys got it, man.
With the outro. The outro's gonna run out.
We're almost halfway. But that's the part I normally like to end on. So thank you, everybody. Go forth and conquer, friends.